I swear I started making this video about just the Arrow, but my curiosity got the better of me and my sanity. Alright, today we're going to pierce into the story of the Avro CF-105 Arrow. This Canadian aircraft never became anything more than a prototype, and yet it is the center point of enough conversation and conspiracies to make the UFO crowd do a double take. Except in the Arrow's case, pretty much all of it is warranted. This flying gold medal of Geneva suggesting industrial achievement was unceremoniously shredded before it had a chance to reach its production potential, and the rabbit hole behind why goes so deep that calling it a bottomless pit would be an understatement. But after digging into it, I have a separate theory than most of the internet. The Canadian plane wasn't traded for American missiles or American planes. It was traded for a Canadian space program. By the early 1950s, Canada may have been a new player to the Soviet containment and nuclear defense mission, but that didn't stop them from trying to contribute as best they could. They had only recently joined NATO in 1949, and they were already hot on the heels of a new domestic aviation industry, starting with the CF-100 Canuck. But war is impulsive. It doesn't like to sit still and wait for you to finish what you're doing. It wants your attention now, and a Cold War is no different. So when NATO intelligence got wind of newer and faster jet bombers like the M4 Bison and the Tu-16 Badger, the Canadians realized they needed to pull a Lightning McQueen and start saying, "I am speed," because that intelligence not only let them know about the bombers, but also what the Soviets might do with them. See, the Soviets had two attack routes for swinging at the United States, across the Pacific Ocean and over the North Pole. Guarding the Pacific coast would be America's job, but if the Soviets felt like smack-talking the flat earthers on their way to start the heat death of the universe, then they were going to have to go through Canada.
Well, you coming?
Where?
Why, to the North Pole, of course!
And an attack like that could be pulled off as early as 1954, so they had to get a move on. They sat down, and Canada realized it had three options. 1, keep making the slower straight-wing Canuck interceptor and risk being outpaced. 2, cancel the Canuck, make something faster, and risk having no backup plan. And 3, keep the Canuck, which was right about to enter service, and make its successor in parallel. 1 was a bad idea, 2 would have the backlash of unbelievable proportions if it was even considered, and 3 was expensive, but the best idea on the table. And while the CF-103 swept-wing version of the Canuck was built to mock-up level by 1951, Avro Canada could tell it wasn't fast enough, aka it was time to start disregarding physics. So they would anticipate the command just as before and start developing a new interceptor in 1952. As expected, the RCAF would follow up in April 1953 and issue specification Air 7-3 for a 2-seat point defense interceptor for this high-speed mission. And nobody except Canada was crazy enough to bid on it because the stat card on this requirement was ridiculous. In order to be courteous enough to accept any generous Tinder date scheduled by the Soviets, the new aircraft would have to take route 50,000 feet going the speed limit of Mach 1.5, get to that route in 5 minutes or less, and hold up to 2 Gs in the turns without losing any speed. And at that speed, it would have to drive up to 230 miles or 370 knot miles to meet its new partner for a very long 5 minutes of fun. And if the dates made things complicated by thinking of themselves as higher standing, the plane would have to take up to route 70,000 feet to reach them. However, this plane would still have to bring a very low-maintenance lifestyle to the table. So this aircraft also needed a low and slow range of 345 miles or 556 knot miles if it wasn't in a hurry, and be able to recharge for another round in an insane 10 minutes. Avro Canada selected a delta wing shape for their new ride, a design known for its high supersonic performance and high structural simplicity. And in July 1953, the Canadian government accepted that design. The preliminary work was done by mid-1954, and in March of 1955, the Canadian government had committed to the program by way of a $260 million Canadian dollar contract. Avro was now obligated to produce 5 Arrow Mark I pre-production aircraft, 35 Arrow Mark II production fighters, and 0 prototypes.
What?
When Avro Canada was going through the design of the Canadian clunker, they ran into a bunch of schedule delays when they realized they needed to make a prototype to test certain things. I'm guessing that the RCAF's tight timelines made them decide to forego prototypes and just sort everything out on the pre-production models. But for the Canuck, that clearly didn't work out. So for round 2, they decided to plan ahead and skip that part start for real. They would perform all the stability tests by launching 8th scale models off of rocket boosters from Nike nuclear missiles, and gather stability data from that instead of building the entire plane first, which is just the most aggressively Canadian test method I've ever heard of. Then, instead of building prototypes, they made the early planes around modifiable structures that they could fix on the fly between tests and save on production. Sounds like a really smart idea, and it kind of makes you wonder why nobody else did that, which Canada would find out very soon. The Arrow would be rolled out into the public eye on October 4th, 1957, and it was a massive plane. This thing was easily the size of a small bomber, and it caught everybody by surprise. For the Canadian people, the sheer size immediately inspired awe and pride, because it was their industry that had created such a massive piece of aerodynamic work. That pride was even more inspired after the first flight on March 25th, 1958. Everybody at Avro took the day off from work and piled onto the testing range like it was a damn baseball game. It was easily one of the most advanced planes in the world at the time. They made it, and they were going to see if it worked.
Once more unto the breach.
And work it did, because not only did it fly, it would break 4 world speed records in the process. During that flight, the aircraft recorded a maximum speed of Mach 1.9 and a max altitude of over 50,000 feet, clearing both of its core performance specs and becoming the fastest fighter jet in the world, at least for 3 months until the F-104 Starfighter took its national speedweight title back. The eventual 5 prototypes built would make a total of 66 flights and 70 hours of flight time, although they would also discover the downsides of the modifiable structures, the volume of technical issues. See, planes are like dudes. They don't like having their junk moved around. Everything's got to be carefully positioned so you don't end up spontaneously keeling over. And for the Arrow, which didn't have that provision laid out, that meant several teething issues, like having trouble retracting the landing gear or deploying the drag chute. It was nothing they couldn't fix, but time was money and the clock was ticking, which was important because this was a pretty powerful piece of machinery for the time. And the basis of that power at the time was the pair of Pratt & Whitney J75 P3 afterburning turbojets, cranking a hog of 12,500 pounds or 55.6 anti-newtons of thrust dry, and roughly 18,500 pounds or 82.3 anti-newtons with a healthy helping of afterburner lube. However, these were neither the planned engines nor the original backup plan. The Arrow project had originally intended to use Rolls-Royce RB106 engines, with the backup plan being the Curtiss-Wright J67s. And both of them were cancelled, meaning they had to find another backup. The backup for the backup, or the backup squared if you will, which would be the Canadian Orenda PS-13 Iroquois, made to provide 18,500 pounds of force dry and 26,000 pounds of force wet. This engine would also provide a record thrust-to-weight ratio for the time by using large amounts of titanium to make up 20% of the engine by weight. However, Orenda still had to figure out how to machine that titanium, and they still needed to test it. After they figured the first part out, in 1957, the Canadians would take it for a test drive by bolting the Iroquois to the side of a loaned American B-47E Stratojet bomber dubbed the CL-52. This only B-47 flown by a foreign nation would be a nightmare to handle, because that side mount created a ton of asymmetric thrust during testing. So much so that after only 66 hours of flight, when it was finally returned to Uncle Sam, he had to scrap it, because the thrust had literally told the airplane to get bent, and it did. But the program couldn't afford to wait for the engines to be finished, so in the meantime, they needed a third backup.
Another one.
And that backup cubed was the J75. However, these engines did not use nearly as much titanium and were substantially heavier, requiring Avro to put a bunch of ballasting weight where the radar would be to compensate. Which means the prototype capped Mach 1.9 on a handicap, and one of the features that probably helped were the bleed bypass ducts that would open at speeds above Mach 1.5. This exact same concept was later developed independently for the SR-71 Blackbird, and it made the Arrow one of the first aircraft to use the working principle of the bypass, later improved on by turbofan engines. It also would have been one of the first warplanes to use what's known as a variable ramp intake. Everybody knows that if you put your finger at the end of a running hose, the water comes out faster. It's the same thing with air until it goes supersonic. Then it gets freaky, because you need to choke it to make it do what you tell it to.
Oh, getting cakey!
By throttling the cross-section of the intake with moving ramps, supersonic air will actually slow down, which lets the engine burn it without being overwhelmed and having a meltdown that will send it and you to hell. Combine this with the separator plates up front, and the Arrow would have been right next to the F-4 Phantom and being one of the first planes with that intake shape. However, these These were supposed to be the most complicated parts. The shoulder-mounted delta wing swept at 61 degrees would let it win most games of the floor is lava, and kept the structure firmly adhered to the KISS principle. However, the stuff inside the wings was not keeping it simple because the wings were stupidly thin to enable the high-altitude speeds the plane wanted. And the problem with that was making sure the plane had enough fuel meant there was no room left for the controls. And while a lot of planes may look like bricks with wings, they're not supposed to fly like them. So to make sure the Arrow didn't amount to a giant lawn dart, they had to run the controls through the fuel tanks and keep them compact, meaning the hydraulics had to work on pressures of over 4,000 psi or over 275 bar. Just for reference, your average car tire is like 2 to 3 bar. If you've ever seen those videos of random shit being turned into paste by a hydraulic press, think of that but on steroids and making a plane turn left with it. But that solution let them keep the fuel load as high as possible, which they would need because the engines were heavy drinkers. The Arrow came with 8 internal tanks carrying a fuel volume of just over 2,500 gallons or just under 9,500 liters. That translated to a fuel mass of 19,561 pounds or 8,872 kilos. Although the usable fuel, or gas you actually suck out of the tank minus the drops left behind in the glass, was actually 19,036 pounds or 8,634 kilos. And all of that could be added to with a 500-gallon or 3,900 pound centerline heavy tank, all of which was needed to accomplish that 230-mile interception range with 5 minutes of combat. I reiterate, very heavy drinker. However, what it lacked in range, it made up for in raw speed. The plane was made for a max speed of Mach 2 or 700 knots equivalent, which it approached during its first test flight, and it could safely pop its speed brakes at full tilt. However, getting there was another matter, so I'm gonna lay out the numbers in the order they would happen. And for kicks and giggles, I'm gonna do it British nature documentary style. Clearly this will only go well, I'm sure. Let's say a wild arrow is resting in its natural habitat when it is alerted to the presence of an incoming Soviet bomber. The arrow may be a flying bird, but it is a Canadian flying bird and it prefers the fight side of the flight response. So the first thing it does is start up and move on to the taxiway. The pilot goes through the checklist because they're about to get up there and fight like the third monkey on the ramp to Noah's Ark and it's starting to rain. They can't have anything going wrong. Then they push the power forwards into full burner and go for takeoff. Thanks to the plane resting at a nose-up angle of 4 degrees, the plane leaves the ground near its maximum load of 69,000 pounds or 31,000 kilos and only 2,630 feet or 800 meters. After a brief initial run to build up speed, it will begin to climb to assert its dominance over its incoming Soviet prey. And given the urgency of the situation, it elects to climb as fast as possible. The poutine is cooking after all, and it would be a shame to have to come home to cold food. So it keeps the throttle in full afterburner and noses up at a speed of roughly 0.92 Mach at 5,000 feet, beginning its ascension at a rate of 31,900 feet per minute or 162 meters per second. It will then make a brief stop at 30,000 feet because that sound barrier isn't going to break itself. The wild arrow accelerates to Mach 1.5 and resumes its climb to its desired altitude of 50,000 feet, reaching it in just under 4 3/4 seconds. The pilot then takes a moment to relax with the automatic flight control system steering the plane on his behalf, waiting for his prey to come into view. And there it is, 4 Soviet bombers flying in the Canadians' general direction. The Canadian pilot skillfully loops around and gets behind them, lines up his shots with his Hughes Mach 1179 fire control system, and fires his 8 AIM-4 Falcon missiles at the bombers. However, these missiles are complete shit and he scores only 2 marks. It is forced to hand off its remaining prey to another nearby arrow, who gleefully gobbles up the remaining snacks as the first one dejectedly returns to base. The arrow slows its approach to 250 knots equivalent airspeed, the structural limit of its landing gear, then waits a bit longer before deploying them and lining up its landing run. While most of its kin land at speeds of 140 to 150 knots, our specimen today comes in a bit fast at 185 knots, the maximum speed at which it can safely deploy its landing chute. Thankfully, it has incredibly sturdy landing gear, able to support up to an astonishing 65,000 pounds or 29,500 kilos on touchdown, because apparently the Canadians decided to add physics to the checklist. After an agonizing 4 seconds of contact, the drag chute and brakes finally fully engage, bringing the aircraft to a stop after just under 5,250 feet or 1,600 meters. However, the Arrow is still hungry and it demands an immediate resupply so it might return to gorging on still more incoming bombers. The ground crew is all too happy to oblige, and the Arrow is more than ready. Much like its older sibling the Canuck, the Arrow possesses a detachable weapons pack. Rather than loading 1 missile at a time, the ground crew drops the entire missile pack from the plane's belly and switches it out for a fresh one quickly and without issue. As it returns to the taxiway for a second run, it notices its fellow Arrow coming in and smirks to itself slightly. The poor bird has had an engine failure. It will need at least 30 minutes to replace its engine, meaning that whatever other pickings are available will be for this Arrow to feast on alone. Now, there are some more nuances to its flight characteristics, which in practice were kinda limited. For example, the max nose sideways angle it could keep relative to its forward flight, or side slip, was only 10 degrees, and the max nose up angle it could keep relative to the same, or its angle of attack, was 15 degrees in level flight. And that max AOA decreased by half a degree for every G of turn. Granted, that last part wasn't much of an issue, because while the plane could handle up to -3 or +7.4 Gs, the flight controls were hard limited to -2.1 or +5 Gs, and pilots would have to stay down to 2/3 of that if they were rolling and pulling out at the same time. But that still meant the Arrow was far from a dogfighter, and unfortunately it was also far from living, because it would come as a complete surprise to Avro when they saw the papers on February 20th, 1959, which rang out loud the headlines that Prime Minister John Diefenbacher had cancelled the Arrow. This day would come to be known as Black Friday, both because of the industrial consequences and especially because it felt like this decision had simply come out of nowhere. With the immediately following adoption of American aircraft and BOMARC missiles, everything seemed to point to a foreign intervention and a complete failure of the Canadian government to recognize their pride. But as is usually the case, the devil is in the details, and it's always the ones you don't see that are gonna get you. So buckle up and let's start with the lead up, because while the Arrow program was designed to bypass the issues from the Canuck program, it still ran into plenty of its own. The first of these happened in 1955. Not only was the J-67 backup engine canceled that year, but the RCAF decided to hop on the American bandwagon of the Sparrow 2D missile development. The Sparrow 2s were planned as an active radar homing version of the Sparrow 1s, effectively giving them fire and forget capability, aka, you go after that guy, I'm gonna go shoot somebody else, you're on your own, Noble Carter out. And these missiles also needed a different fire control system called the Astra, which was completely unproven. Basically, the RCAF went ooh shiny and told the engineers to stick it on before they even knew if the entire thing worked yet. And the problem was, they really didn't work. Due to the power consumption of active homing radars being much higher than the beam-riding Sparrow 1s, the Sparrow 2s needed to store more power. This made the missile larger because the battery technology of the time was limited, and in the end, it still wasn't enough. As a result, the Navy canceled the program in 1956, at which point the RCAF went, oh shit, we needed that, and swooped in to assign Canadair to make it work. Then, in 1957, the Rolls-Royce engine got canceled, leaving Avro scrambling for the Orenda Iroquois, which was followed by them running into the same problems as the Americans with the Sparrow missiles and giving up on them for the Falcons or even 1 or 2 Genie rockets in September 1958.
Bet you I'm right.
Bet you you're wrong.
Bet you're a skank.
Bet you're an asshole.
Bitch, I eat people!
So 4 separate cancellations and 3 changes in equipment loadout in 4 years' time. Not exactly a recipe for on time and under budget. Bolt on the advances in missile tech, especially in surface-to-air missiles, and a lot of people weren't even sure if manned aircraft were going to be viable. But the problems wouldn't wait for that to come out to start happening. Before 1956 was out, the Canadian government limited the program to only 11 test planes instead of the 5 test planes and 35 full-fledged fighters. Then the missile changes led the still Liberal government of Canada to place a $216 million spending cap on the Arrow program in February 1957. However, it was 1958 that really killed the Arrow because everything changed that year.
Here it comes!
A lot of the cancellation process is attributed to the conservative John Diefenbacher, who was elected Prime Minister of Canada the year before on June 10, 1957. He was kind of the face of the decision, and it's really not that helpful that his words on the matter sounded like a fucking Thanos quote.
The hardest choices require the strongest wills.
However, his decision against the Arrow was not something he did by himself. When you trace back the details, most of the push against the Canadian aircraft was put together by his Minister of Defense, George Pierce. And the first question that came to my mind was, what are this guy's credentials? Because for all I knew, he could be just another jazz-playing fighter moron type who only thought they knew what they were talking about. And you would be horribly wrong, because Pierce was easily one of the farthest things from a pushover. Retired Major General George Pierce had received the Victoria Cross, the highest British honor, after his actions in the World War I Battle of Passchendaele in October 1917. The short version is that during the battle, his advance was threatened by a German position, so he looked at that position, said mine, and took it, before advancing to his actual objective, which he would then hold despite being noticeably outnumbered. He would continue to fight through all of World War I despite being wounded 5 times, one of which was during Passchendaele, and then he would take up more command posts throughout the Second World War before retiring in February 1945. Arguably one of the finest Geneva suggestion extraordinaires the country had to offer, and probably somebody who knows his stuff. So what could have convinced this guy that the Arrow was a bad play?
Now, we all go down the rabbit hole together.
Well, like I said, 1958 was the year that killed the Arrow, and it started right off the bat in January. That month, Canada's Joint Intelligence Committee published a top-secret report called The Threat to North America 1958 to 1967, where they basically sat down and said, okay, what do we think we're going to get shot with, and how do we think they're going to do it? Had they asked the Americans, their thought process at the time was this idea called the bomber gap, basically them thinking that the Soviets had way more heavy bombers than America did. However, Canadian intelligence was on top of that like maple syrup on pancakes and had gotten a very good look at the Soviet bomber fleet. And as a result, they predicted that the primary threat from the Soviets over the next several decades would not be bombers, but missiles. Not because missiles were the future of warfare or something like that, but because the Soviets simply had more of them. The Canadians knew that the Soviets only had 65 heavy bombers they could actually make nuclear strikes on North America with in total, and only 2 or 3 bombers of those types were being built a month. Canadian intelligence figured that the smart thing for those bombers to do then was to use standoff missiles to launch long-range attacks, instead of getting up close and personal and punching a city in the face. The threat that was much more noticeable and direct were intercontinental ballistic missiles from the developing Soviet space program. They had made 2 satellite launches by this point, one of which had been sent on the same day the Arrow had been rolled out of the factory. Sputnik. And if they could put a satellite in orbit, they could bring a warhead down from orbit too. So now everyone is starting to think about space-based threats, and the intel report reinforced that concern. It was speculated that the Soviet Union could have 100 ICBMs with a 3,500 to 5,000 nautical mile range in service by 1960 at the earliest, and this report came out in 1958. As a result, even if the Soviets bothered to use their bombers, the Arrow would need a much longer range to stop them than it was made for. Interceptors were going to have to become more multi-role, and to some degree, the rest of the world was aware of that as well. By the 60s and 70s, the only arguably pure interceptor left in the world was the MiG-25, and that was mostly because we kept freaking the Soviets out with the Mach 3 pizza oven. According to his public statements, this January 1958 report was the official catalyst for Pierce starting to consider canceling the Arrow. Now that most threats would come from space, the Arrow might not even be able to serve its purpose. And this is where my theory comes in. To counter space threats, Canada would need a space program, which it had only started making in 1957, the same year as Sputnik. They would need to pour the coal to it to keep up, and to do that, they would need to pull money from other places. And with its purpose now in question, plus the amount of money it was taking up, the Arrow seemed like the ideal program to pull funding from. But to pull that money, they would either need to bring the Arrow's cost down or provide a substitute entirely. And while it wasn't an independent option, there was an option. Back in the mid-1950s, America and Canada had signed an agreement to let Uncle Sam set up 3 lines of radar warning networks in Canada, known from south to north as the Pine Tree Line, the Mid-Canada Line or the McGill Fence, and the Dew Line. This cooperation had eventually led to discussion of integrated air defenses between the two countries, which on May 12, 1958 turned into the bilateral defense agreement called NORAD. Now, this is the part where some people think America began forcing its way into Canadian affairs, but you gotta remember, the man in charge of Canadian defense right now is George Pierce, and if his battle experience says anything about the man's character, not only could he think clearly on his own, he was also not the kind of man who bends the knee to a larger force. If the Americans told him to shut up and take their missiles, I'm pretty sure he would have cracked open the checklist right then and there.
You heard me, slave. Go to hell.
So the real source of this change of thought probably came from a fair conversational meeting, 2 of which occurred on the 4th and 5th of August 1958 between him and several U.S. officials, according to the online meeting notes available on the State Department's Office of the Historian website. And you'll never guess what the first thing on the docket was. Pierce was concerned about the Arrow's program cost, which was, at the time, 500 million Canadian dollars. Pause real quick, that was a lot of money for Canada in 1958. I had to look it up. In the 5 years that the Arrow was in development, Canada's GDP in then year's money totaled up to roughly 185 billion Canadian dollars, meaning that the Arrow program by itself consumed about 0.3% of that total 5-year GDP. It's also been quoted as being between 20 and 30% of their annual $1 billion defense budget during that time. Just for reference, the entire modern US defense budget stays at right around 4% of GDP, and the $34 billion budget we had in 1958 was around 10%, and that's still highballing it a little. So I wouldn't go so far as to say the Arrow was bankrupting Canada, but it was definitely not cheap.
However, we're having a distinctly difficult time justifying some of these expenses.
And this thing wouldn't have been ready until 1962, meaning there would have been still more money to spend. And because of that per unit cost, he didn't know if that would lead Canada to buy 50 or 200 planes, which really wasn't enough because Canadian estimates stated they needed 300 Arrows to cover their borders. And so the first thing Pierce did when he sat down was to throw a Hail Mary and ask if the US would buy some to bring the cost down. He knew that America had their own options and they more than likely wouldn't bite, but I suspect he was thinking he wouldn't have felt right going home without at least taking a shot while he could. Unfortunately, he was right, and while the US did acknowledge the Arrow as a very good plane, they felt the F-106 Delta Dart was better for them and refused. So knowing that he had at least taken his shot, the Canadian Defense Minister then moved to the more pragmatic problem of finding a missile alternative to the Arrow's mission. Pierce disclosed that the Canadian government might then scrap the CF-105 in favor of missiles, stating, quote, "It would be better to take the loss than to tie up a large part of the defense budget for the next 5 years making an outmoded weapon." However, instead of comparing the CF-105 and the F-106 the next day as both sides had planned, they instead came to the conclusion that if needed, the CF-105 could be reasonably replaced by the cheaper F-101B Voodoo, a plane they would later adopt starting in 1961. But Pierce had also given more thought to the political and national value of the Arrow. He was worried that the Arrow couldn't be cancelled because he knew the public backlash would be enormous, and so he wouldn't commit to anything at the time. The US stated they understood, and that was the end of any recorded conversation between Canada and the United States about canceling the Arrow. But it was only the beginning of the conversation about adopting the BOMARC. The BOMARC missile was one of America's earliest surface-to-air missile programs, designed to shoot down bomber formations with a nuclear warhead. Because why hit you directly when we can just incinerate your postal code? This was a point defense weapon just like the Arrow, and more importantly, it was cheaper. Using the BOMARCs in the stead of the Arrow would free up funding for the Canadian space program, and still allow Canada to defend itself against bomber attacks. However, an excerpt from an interview Pierce had on April 5, 1967 noted that he was reluctant to consider buying the BOMARC missiles at all. While he knew that he was looking for a backup plan for the Arrow, by now he was so convinced that the primary threat would be ICBMs that he wasn't even sure the BOMARCs would matter. But he would eventually choose them, and one source I found noted that Pierce mentioned in either another interview or the same one that an American official told him to ditch the Arrow and go with the BOMARC, and that was the conversation that convinced him to do it. However, that source didn't name the official, there's no record of that recommendation I could find in the Office of the Historian's files, and I also wasn't able to find the full interview record that they were referring to, leaving me with no context as to what the conversation was that led to that recommendation. And I find it hard to believe that somebody with Pierce's combat record, who's mulling over a very sensitive topic, would run into some rando American who just so happens to suggest, out of the blue, hey, you should ditch your indigenous project and buy our missiles instead, and that his response would somehow be,
Well, that sounds reasonable.
that doesn't make sense. Again, he'd go looking for Geneva on the spot. But there's more in that April 1967 interview, where he also stated he was only convinced when other people, probably the Americans, countered that the bombers were still there, even if in small numbers, and they might follow an ICBM attack as a second wave, which might be the convincing point that other source was talking about, and the context behind it. So when he decided to advise the purchase of the BOMARCs, it sounds like he only did so as a backup plan in case his space threat theory was wrong. And if that sounds like America trying to force yet another weapons sale, I think I should remind you that these were nuclear weapons. They are subject to a lot of security constraints, and they are not something you can just sell to make a quick dime. In fact, those Office of the Historian records disclose that those exact constraints would create another problem for the whole picture, figuring out how to make Canada part of the BOMARC's production so the Canadian people and economy would still have something. In particular, Pierce and Diefenbacher both expressed to American officials that Canada's drive for independence meant that Canada had to make something of its own for the people to be satisfied if the Arrow was given up, and they couldn't be simple parts.
It didn't work.
So they negotiated to get Canadian companies to build larger chunks of the BOMARC missiles instead of just smaller parts. As for the installations, while Canada would have to sink some money in to prepare the launch sites, they wouldn't be alone, and the sites would be paid for by way of a cost-sharing agreement, 2/3 America and 1/3 Canada. This decision would be announced by Diefenbacher on August 11, 1958, and the Arrow's production would be slashed the following month before being cancelled outright in February. And so to answer the largest theory that the BOMARCs replaced the Arrow solely on the basis of cost, it sounds to me like the BOMARCs' impact on the Arrow program wasn't cost. It was purpose, and a backup plan at that. In the end, the things that replaced the Arrow's job were the BOMARCs and the CF-101s. But the thing that replaced the Arrow's mission was the Canadian space program. But the fallout from that was still incredibly destructive. As mentioned before, Avro wasn't informed of the 1959 decision in advance. Back in September of 58, when they were told the program would be slashed, they thought they had until March 31st of that year to produce better results and cut per-plane costs. As a result, when the news dropped, the plans they had to set more records on the next flight tests and cut the cost to $3.75 million an aircraft, still more than twice what they'd set out for, were pretty much all thrown away. And sadly, that wasn't the end of it. By July 1959, all 5 prototype Arrows were finished being cut apart with blowtorches and saws, while blueprints, models, designs, and production machinery were destroyed. Every trace of the Arrow just gone. And one of the things that doesn't make sense to me is why? Why destroy the entire collection? There were claims of Soviet espionage, and proof was later found that the Soviets did have spies inside the program, but we have no idea if they knew about it at that time or not.
Just doesn't hold water.
It was also relatively known that Dief had beef with Avro Canada's president over his luxurious lifestyle, and so it's possible this may have been the point where the spite came out to play. But if you consider the theory of the space program, a third, more brutal idea comes to mind. With Diefenbacher's and Pierk's decision to hedge their bets on the space program, it was possible that if any trace of the Arrow remained, a future administration could try and double back on their decision, scrapping the space program to bring the Arrow back. In their minds, that wouldn't be a strategically sound play, but it would be a popular one, as evidenced by the, quote, heavy tide of personal mail from people all over Canada as showing far more bitterness towards the United States than he could previously recall, all in terms of the CF-105 decision. So it's possible the decision to scrap the Arrow was a scorched earth, burn the ships approach to force Canada's future in the direction they thought was most important, that being targeting the strategic space threat. But luckily for history and enthusiasts everywhere, not all of the Avro engineers followed orders, and some parts still made it to museums, with the biggest ones being a cockpit and a pair of rudders. There was even one absolute mad lad engineer named Ken Barnes who also saved a complete set of blueprints and hid them until 2020. You can find those digitized frame diagrams in Canada's National Archives, and get this, the original blueprint book is stored in the Diefenbacher Canada Centre, which is either irony or disrespect at its finest.
Both is good.
However, the Canadian shift towards the space race came at a massive price. The announcement to kill the Arrow resulted in 14,000 layoffs at Avro Canada the same day, and over time it would cost up to 25,000 Canadian jobs. By the time Avro Canada was dissolved by its 1930s parent company Hawker Siddeley in April 1962, only 200 engineers were still working there. The domestic military aviation industry in Canada effectively died with this existential transition. However, and likely because of that, not everybody decided they wanted to work for Canada's space program, and instead jumped the border and joined the newly formed NASA in the United States, where they would become leaders in America's manned space programs. And after having done the research into the effort Canada put into their aviation industry in the name of their independent power, I get why Canada never forgave the loss of the Arrow, and I don't blame them. An entire avenue of national industry, and more importantly, national pride, was shut down for reasons they were never told. To all the American watchers, imagine if back in the early 70s, when America was starting to release the F-14 and the F-15, suddenly both programs were canceled, ordered scrapped, and mysteriously our Air Force was filled with Jaguars or Mirages or Vigans or something within a couple years. And then we never got the F-16, the F-A-18, or any of our stealth aircraft. The only thing we got out of it was a flag on the moon. I don't think I'd find it very comforting.
I'm sorry. I'm usually far more composed. I'm just a little bit absolutely livid.
And so I'm not sure how many Canadian viewers will find it comforting, but the space program they built with the Arrow's money didn't disappear. After completing the Churchill Research Range in northern Manitoba in 1958 that they'd started the previous year, Canada made swift progress in the realm of space. They helped found the Committee on Space Research in October 1958, launched over 3,500 all-Canadian sounding rockets for suborbital data collection, and started making communications components for space satellites. And on September 28, 1962, the same year the Arrow would have become operational, the Canadians made history by becoming the third country on the planet to get their own satellite, Alouette 1, into orbit, after the Soviets and the Americans. They had built up a successful space program in just 5 years. Sure, their agency wasn't officially established yet, and a lot of their stuff still had to go through America's NASA, like the satellite itself, which was launched from a NASA site in California. But the satellite itself was purely Canadian designed and built, and while it was supposed to only live for a year, it would stay in orbit and deliver data back to Earth for 10 years, and deliver the message to the Soviets that Canada wouldn't be so easily ignored.
I am sick and tired of being ignored!
And believe it or not, the spirit of the Arrow program endured so hard it never fully died, because in 2011, a proposed Arrow Mark III almost made a comeback as an alternative to the F-35. I suspect the main motivation was that the Arrow already had an internal weapons bay, but the federal government in Ottawa rejected the proposal in 2012 as too risky, costly, and time-consuming to update the old design. And considering the long list of changes they'd have to make, we're talking stealth, planform alignment, new engines, more electronic power, advanced avionics and sensors, data links, they might as well build a new plane from scratch. However, while that fell through, there is another project that I think is still moving along. On March 23, 2005, the Avro Museum in Calgary, Alberta approved a budget for volunteers to recreate a 60% scale pilotable version of the Arrow within the limits of the Canadian civilian aviation laws, known as the Arrow 2 project. I am not sponsored by them or working with them in any way, I just thought that was cool, and if you want to donate to the museum for it, I'll leave a link to their page in the description and up in the corner of your screen. Because just as an arrow always moves forward in flight, the spirit of the Arrow has carried it forward through time, and for all we know, it might land in front of us very soon. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.